Well, there's a new trend. Women are now having parties celebrating the birthday of their frozen eggs. Can you believe this? It's not fake. It's real. As though the eggs, if they haven't been fertilized, it's not a person. It's just an egg. I don't think they understand that. But this is something that's happening. It was in the New York Times, so it must be true, right? Anyway, goofiness prevails again.
This is a video for all the single ladies. If you've not seen me before, I'm Becky, I'm 40 and I'm single. As women, there are so many other things that we should be celebrating that we just don't. Example, a few of my friends at the moment are going through the process of freezing their eggs, right? This is such a big, stressful and expensive process. They are going through it all by their goddamn selves, funding it themselves, and they are going through the actual logistics of it themselves. This needs to be celebrated.
But I did see something that was very interesting and very fascinating to me. There's a new statue being built in Brazil of St. Michael the Archangel, and it's going to be the tallest statue in the world of any statue. It is 75 meters tall, so that's like 225 feet or so. That's an enormous statue, and the image that it's going to be based on, I'm looking at a picture of it. He's holding the scales in his one hand, the scales of justice, I guess, and in his other hand, he has his sword raised high up over his head. So that's wonderful. We should have more statues like that all over the world.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
Hi, thanks for tuning in again to Armor of God. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And hopefully you'll find this video both useful and edifying. Well then, let's not waste any more time, and for the first clip in the compilation this time, I'd like to share a conversation between our brother William Albrecht and Father Vincent Lampert, as well as Subdeacon Daniel. And there's something that Subdeacon Daniel said that caught my interest, and I thought I'd include that here in this video.
Now, let me ask you this, Subdeacon. When it comes to the incredible Syriac tradition, which shares so many incredible similarities with our fellow apostolic brethren, is it quite prevalent to hear of spiritual attacks?
Yeah, usually, not always, but usually in the Middle East, it's more common because of the black magic that happens over there. And also, it's usually, believe it or not, Muslims who are coming to us for exorcisms, because they tend to have the problem of being possessed more than Christians do.
Wow.
So yeah, they will come, and the priest will perform an exorcism over them. It happens in the Syriac. In the Syriac tradition, we use the exorcism found in the baptism rite, which in the baptism rite we have the person, usually it's the godfather if the person being baptized is a baby, or if the person's an adult, so then it would be himself. Three times facing east, he confesses Christ, and then he returns and faces west, and he denounces Satan also 3 times. And then the priest and whoever is celebrating the baptism, the celebrant, he will, there's a particular exorcism in the prayers that he would say onto the person. It's this exorcism that they use on whoever they're performing the exorcism on. I don't know, I'm unaware if we have other exorcism prayers, but I know when they're performing exorcisms, it's usually these that they use. And the Copts, though, they have their own thing, and they do it a lot also in Egypt. Egypt probably even more so. It's happening over there. Yeah.
And as it's going to be October soon, so I thought it's a good idea to include this one from Father Daniel Reehil as well. Anyway, in regards to Halloween, we're planning to interview a few exorcists throughout October to speak about it, especially when it comes to the occult.
The roots of Halloween, because a lot of people don't understand how this came about. And it's actually a very old tradition that predates Jesus Christ. So the Druids, these were the witches and warlocks that were in the Celtic countries. So Britain, Ireland, Scotland, even in parts of France and Germany. They observed the end of summer by making sacrifices to the god Samhain, which is the lord of death. And it was right about November 1st, because they believed that the beginning, November 1st, was the day of death because the leaves were falling. It's getting darker earlier. Temperatures are dropping. So they believed that the god Muk Allah, their sun god, was losing strength and that Samhain, the lord of death, was overpowering him. They also believed that on October 31st, Samhain assembled the spirits of all who had died during the previous year. I mean, this is all, pagan witchcraft, and but this is what they believed. So they also believed that these spirits had been confined to inhabit animals' bodies for the prior year. So after they died, they spent a year in an animal's body as punishment for their evil deeds. And then they were allowed to return to their former home to visit the living on the eve of the Feast of Samhain, so on October 31st. The Druid priests would lead the people in diabolical worship ceremonies in which horses and cats and sheep, oxen, even human beings would be rounded up, stuffed into these wicker cages, and burned to death. And this was done to appease Samhain, this god, and to keep spirits from harming them. So Halloween, from the very beginning, was a celebration of death. You must know that. And the Druid priests and people would go from house to house asking for these, calves and sheep and even human beings. And those who gave were promised prosperity, and those who refused to give were cursed and threatened. So they also believed it was likely that the wandering spirits would get angry at those who didn't participate. So if you set a treat out for them, they would not trick or curse you. So hence the origins of trick or treat. And when we do it today, it's an enactment of this Druid practices. So it's a bad thing to do. Today, candy replaces human sacrifice and animal sacrifice. But, the demons still look at it as an appeasement to these evil spirits. So just because you don't believe it doesn't mean they don't believe it. That's why you have to be careful with these sort of things. The candlelit pumpkin or skull served as a signal to mark those farms or homes that were sympathetic to the Satanists and thus deserving of mercy when the terror of the night began, this trick-or-treating ritual. The apparently harmless lighted pumpkin face of the jack-o'-lantern is an ancient symbol of a damned soul. So there you kind of have it. The costumes, where did that come from? Well, they also originated with these Druid death rites. People and animals were screeching in agony while being burned to death, the observers would dress in costumes made of animal skins and heads, and they would dance and chant and jump around through the flames in hope of warding off the evil spirits. It was a very ritualistic practice. So that's kind of the problem that Halloween presents. In the Bible, in many, many places, Old and New Testament, it says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. No fellowship at all. And St. Paul says to the Corinthians, the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. Okay? 1 Corinthians 10:20.
And here's one on the subject from Father Vincent Lampert as well.
Here in the United States, there are many programs on TV that have to do with the devil. There are a lot of shows on now about killers and ghosts and goblins. And again, it's about instilling fear into people's lives. And again, the devil will use fear as a way to try to redirect us away from God, whereby the focus becomes on him. There are many examples here in the United States where even high schools now are allowing satanic clubs, for example, where people can get together to glamorize Satan. So Halloween is the main time of year that people do that, but now it's becoming almost mainstream where people are literally doing that every day of the year. And I think that's the danger with Halloween, is that it has put the devil into the mainstream, not just at a certain time of the year now, but he's now beginning to permeate society on all levels. The pagan practices associated with Halloween are inherently evil. You touched on the fact that it's All Hallows Eve. It's the day before we celebrate All Saints' Day and then going into All Souls' Day. But there is that danger associated with Halloween that it glorifies evil. It's kind of the devil's hour, if you will, for Halloween, because People are fascinated again by evil. People are dressing up as ghosts and goblins. You know, here in the United States, Halloween has become the second biggest holiday of the year, right after Christmas. People now decorate their houses with orange lights. They'll put ghosts and goblins in the trees and witches. People will put grave markers in their front yard. Skeletons are everywhere. But again, people have become so fascinated by the devil, and the devil would just love that, because when we celebrate Halloween in that manner, we're actually glorifying the evil one. When our goal as Catholics should be to honor and glorify God, we honor and glorify the saints, the holy men and women down through the ages who have demonstrated a great fidelity to God by growing in holiness and virtue. We think about All Souls Day, where we pray for the souls of all the faithful departed who are in purgatory. So it should be a time of religious celebration, but unfortunately, I think Halloween has become a time to glamorize evil. And when we glamorize evil, then we are giving glory to the one who's associated with all of that, namely the devil himself. And I think that's the greatest danger when it comes to Halloween. Certainly, there'd be nothing wrong with children wanting to put on a costume and go and ask, for candy. But, people can dress up as a saint. They can dress up as a princess or a cowboy or whatever. But again, the danger is when we begin to focus too much on the reality of the devil and his demons.
And there's another one that I'd like to share with you from Father Daniel Reehil before we get to the second part of this video, where we'll continue with Blessed Anne Catherine. For this clip, on the other hand, it's going to be about stress, anxiety, and fear.
Stress, anxiety, and fear. Because those three, you could call them emotions. They are emotions, but they're also demons. And they are rampant these days. I have so many people that are coming in, walking in off the street with no appointment, that are literally falling apart, shaking, because they're so frightened of the events that are happening in their life and the events that are happening in the world. And, even sadly, I had a woman this week who has a little 2.5-year-old, and she attempted to take her life. Luckily, the paramedics revived her and saved her, but she was giving up. And when she got out of the hospital, she came to see me, and we prayed together. And I had to remind her that God created her out of his love, that he's sustaining her with his love, and his love is awaiting her return at the end of her life in heaven on his terms. She doesn't get to choose that day. And after we prayed, I gave her a little hug, and she smiled, and she looked like the anxiety had left. And I did do some deliverance with her. I'm telling you, there are spirits that are attacking people and making them very nervous and worn out and fearful. And you can't take a pill to make those things go away. The psychologist will tell you can. They have antidepressants. They have anti-anxiety drugs. But if it's a demon, it's not going to help.
And now for the second half of this video, as I said earlier, we are going to continue with the visions shared by Blessed Anne Catherine in this video. As always, hopefully you'll find this segment of the video useful and that you'll learn something every time you're here with us.
As the Blessed Virgin felt her end approaching, in accordance with the directions of her divine Son, she called the apostles to her by prayer. She was now in her 63rd year. At the time of Christ's birth, she was in her 15th. Before his ascension, Jesus had made known to his most holy mother what she should say at the end of her earthly career to the apostles and some of the disciples who should be with her. He told her also that she should bless them, and that it would conduce very much to their welfare and eternal salvation. He entrusted to her also certain spiritual labors for the general good, which being accomplished, her longing after heaven was to be realized. Jesus had at the same time made known to Magdalene that she was to live concealed in the wilderness, and that Martha was to establish a community of women. He added that he himself would always be with them. At the prayer of the Blessed Virgin, the apostles received, through angels, and admonition to repair to her at Ephesus. In the various places in which they were, they had erected little churches here and there. Many of them were constructed merely of platted rods or branches covered with clay, but all were of the same form as Mary's house, that is, three-cornered in the back. They were provided with altars for the celebration of Holy Mass. The journeys of the apostles, so distant, so exceedingly remote, were not made without divine assistance. Although they themselves were perhaps unconscious of it at the time, yet I do not doubt that they passed through many dangers in a supernatural manner. I often saw them walking unnoticed through the midst of a crowd. I have likewise seen that the miracles wrought by them among the various pagan nations were very numerous and of a different kind from those recorded of them in the Holy Scriptures. They labored everywhere according to the peculiar needs of the people. I saw that they carried about them the bones of the prophets or those of the first Christian martyrs, which relics they placed before them in time of prayer or when offering the holy sacrifice. When called to Mary, Peter was in the region of Antioch with another apostle. Andrew, who had shortly before been in Jerusalem, but had there been persecuted, was not far from Peter. I saw them both on their way to Ephesus at places not very distant from each other. They passed the nights in those open inns that are met along the roads in hot countries. As Peter was lying one night near a wall, a resplendent youth approached him, took him by the hand, and bade him arise and hasten to Mary. On the way, the youth said, he would meet Andrew. Peter, who had grown stiff from age and fatigue, rose to a sitting posture, and clasping his hands round his knees to support himself, listened to the angel's words. Then he stood up, put on his mantle, girded himself, took his staff, and started on his journey. He soon came up with Andrew, who had been called by the same apparition. After traveling some distance, they were met by Thaddeus, who also had received a similar warning. They journeyed together to Mary, with whom they found John. Jude, Thaddeus, and Simon were in Persia when they received their summons. Thomas, who was in stature thick and short and had reddish-brown or auburn hair, was of all the apostles the farthest off. He arrived only after Mary's death. When the angel came to call him, he was praying in a hut built of reeds. With one very poor, simple servant, I saw him sailing alone in a little boat far over the waters. Then he journeyed across the country, turning aside from all the cities. A disciple now accompanied him. Thomas was in India when he received the warning. Before receiving it, he had determined to go into Tartary, and he could not bring himself to change his plans. He always wanted to do so much. Therefore it was that he was often behind time. So off he started northward almost across China, where Russia now is. Here he was called a second time. He obeyed the summons and hurried to Ephesus. Thomas did not return to Tartary after Mary's death. He was pierced with a lance in India. I have seen that he set up a stone in this last-named country, upon which he knelt in prayer, and upon which the marks of his knees remained impressed. He told the people that when the sea would reach that stone, another would here preach Jesus Christ. John had shortly before been in Jericho, for he often journeyed to Palestine. He usually abode in Ephesus, however, and the country around. Bartholomew was in Asia, east of the Red Sea. He was handsome and very active, his complexion fair and his forehead high. He had large eyes, black curly hair, and a short, crisp beard, black and parted on the chin. He had already converted a king and all the royal family. Paul was not summoned. Those only were called that were related or acquainted with the Holy Family. Peter, Andrew, and John were the first to reach the Blessed Virgin's house. She was already near death. She was lying calmly on her couch in her sleeping place. I saw the maidservant looking very sorrowful in this and that corner of the house, also outdoors, where she prayed prostrate with outstretched arms. I saw also 2 of Mary's sisters and 5 disciples coming together to the house. All looked tired and exhausted. They embraced each other tenderly when they met. Many wept from mingled feelings of joy and sorrow at meeting on such an occasion. When the apostles went all together into Mary's little sleeping chamber in order to take leave of her, they wore their long white albs and broad mantles. The screens that separated the front from the back of the house had been removed. The disciples and holy women remained standing in the front apartment. I saw that Mary sat upright, that the apostles knelt in turn at the side of her couch, and that she prayed over each and blessed him with her hands laid upon him crosswise. She did the same to the disciples and to the women. One of the latter, who stood quite bent in two over Mary, received an embrace from her. When Peter stepped up to the couch, I saw that he had a roll of scriptures in his hand. Mary then addressed them in a body, and did all that Jesus had in Bethania directed her to do. I saw also that she told John what was to be done with her remains, and that he should see that her clothes were divided between her own maidservant and a maiden of the neighborhood who came sometimes to render her service. As she spoke, she pointed to the press or partition, and I saw the maid going to it, opening and closing it. And now the altar with its covers, one red, the other white, was placed in front of the crucifix of the Blessed Virgin's own oratory. Peter here celebrated the Holy Mass with the same ceremonies as I had seen him first observe in the church at the pool of Bethsaida. Tapers, not lamps, were burning on the altar. Mary was in a sitting posture on her couch during the whole celebration. Peter was vested in the large mantle and the pallium, whose colors glanced from white to red. These he wore over the white robe. The 4 apostles assisting him were also vested in festal mantles. After the communion, Peter gave the Blessed Sacrament to all present. During this Holy Mass, Philip arrived from Egypt. Weeping bitterly, he received the benediction of the Blessed Virgin, and after the others, the Blessed Sacrament. Peter bore the Blessed Sacrament to Mary and the cross hanging on his breast, and John carried on a shallow dish, the chalice containing the most sacred blood. This chalice was white, small as if for pouring, and of the same shape as that used at the Last Supper. Its stem was so short that it could be held with 2 fingers only. Thaddeus now brought forward a little incense basin. Peter first gave the Blessed Virgin the last anointing, just as that sacrament is administered at the present day. Next he administered Holy Communion, which she received sitting up without support. Then she sank back again on her pillow, and after the apostles had offered a short prayer, she received the chalice from John, but not now in so upright a posture. After communion, Mary spoke no more. Her countenance, blooming and smiling as in youth, was raised above. I no longer saw the roof of her chamber, and the lamp appeared to be suspended in the open air. A pathway of light arose from Mary up to the heavenly Jerusalem, up to the throne of the most holy Trinity. On either side of this pathway I saw clouds of light out of which gazed angelic faces. Mary raised her arms to the heavenly Jerusalem. Her body with all its wrappings was floating so high above the couch that I could see under it. A figure of light, also with upraised arms, appeared to issue from Mary. The 2 choirs of angels united under this figure and soared up with it, as if separating it from the body, which now sank back upon the couch, the hands crossed upon the breast. Many holy souls, among whom I recognized Joseph, Anne, John the Baptist, Zachary, and Elizabeth, came to meet her. But up she soared, followed by them, to her son, whose wounds were flashing light far more brilliant than that which surrounded him. He received her and placed in her hand a scepter, pointing at the same time over the whole circumference of the earth. At last I saw, and the sight filled me with joy, a multitude of souls released from purgatory and soaring up to heaven, and I received the surety that every year, on the feast of Mary's Assumption, many of her devout clients are freed from purgatory. The hour of Mary's death was made known to me as that of none, at which time also Jesus had died on the cross. Peter and John likewise must have seen the glory of Mary's blessed soul, for their faces were turned upward, but the other apostles were kneeling bowed to the ground. The body of the Blessed Virgin lay radiant with light upon the couch, the eyes closed, the hands crossed upon the breast. All present knelt, adoring God. At last the women covered the blessed remains with a sheet, put all the furniture of the house aside and covered it, even covering the fireplace. Then they veiled themselves and prayed together in a space in the front of the house, sometimes kneeling, sometimes sitting. The apostles, too, enveloped their head with the scarf they wore about their shoulders, and ranged in order for prayer. They took turns, 2 at a time, to kneel and pray at the head and feet of the blessed remains. I saw them exchanging places with one another 4 times in the day, and I likewise saw them making the way of the cross. Andrew and Matthias were busy preparing the place of burial, which was the little grotto that Mary and John had arranged at the end of the way of the cross to represent the holy sepulchre of Christ. It was not so large as Jesus' tomb, being scarcely as high as a man, and was surrounded by a little garden hedged in by stakes. A pathway ran obliquely down into it, and the stone couch, which was like a narrow altar, was hollowed on top to the shape of a body enveloped in its winding sheet, the head being a trifle higher than the foot. The station of Mount Calvary was on a hill nearby. No cross was erected on it, but there was one cut out on the stone. Andrew was especially active in preparing the grotto and setting up a door firmly in front of the tomb proper. Before the holy body was shrouded in its white garments and enveloped in the winding sheets, Peter celebrated the unbloody sacrifice on the altar of the oratory and gave Holy Communion to the other apostles. After that, Peter and John approached the body in their mantles of ceremony. John carried a vessel of oil with which Peter anointed, in the form of a cross and with accompanying prayers, the forehead, hands, and feet of the holy body, which was afterward entirely enveloped in linens by the women. They placed on the head a wreath of flowers, white, red, and sky blue, as a symbol of Mary's virginity, and over the face a transparent veil, through which it could be seen encircled by the wreath. The feet also, which were bound up in aromatic herbs, could be traced through the linens that enveloped them. The arms and hands were bound crosswise on the breast. Thus prepared, the holy body was laid in a coffin of snow-white wood with a tightly fitting arched cover, which was fastened down at the head, the foot, and in the middle with gray straps. The coffin was then laid on a litter. Everything was done with the utmost solemnity, and all were penetrated with deep emotion. The sorrow of the mourners was more human and more openly expressed than at Jesus' burial, at which holy awe and reverence predominated. When it was time to bear the coffin to the grotto, 1/2 hour distant, Peter and John raised it from the litter and carried it in their hands to the door of the house, outside of which it was again laid on the litter, which Peter and John then raised upon their shoulders. 6 of the apostles thus carried it in turn. The coffin hung between the bearers as in a cradle, for the poles of the litter were run through leathern straps or matting. Some of the apostles walked before the coffin praying, and after it came the women. Lamps or lanterns on poles were carried. Before reaching the grotto, the litter was set down. 4 of the apostles bore the coffin in and placed it in the hollow of the tomb. All went one by one into the grotto, where they knelt in prayer before the holy body, honoring it and taking leave of it. Then the tomb was shut in by a wicker screen that extended from the front edge of the tomb to the top of the vaulted wall above. Before the entrance of the grotto, they made a trench, which they planted so thickly with blooming flowers and bushes covered with berries that one could gain access to it only from the side, and that only by making his way through the underwood. On the night following the burial took place the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin into heaven. I saw on this night several of the apostles and holy women in the little garden, praying and singing psalms before the grotto. I saw a broad pathway of light descend from heaven and rest upon the tomb. In it were circles of glory full of angels, in the midst of whom the resplendent soul of the Blessed Virgin came floating down. Before her went her divine Son, the marks of his wounds flashing with light. In the innermost circle, that which surrounded the holy soul of Mary, the angels appeared like the faces of very young children. In the second circle, they were like those of children from 6 to 8 years old. And in the outermost, like the faces of youths, I could clearly distinguish only the face, the rest of the figure consisting of perfectly transparent light. Encircling the head of the Blessed Virgin like a crown was a choir of blessed spirits. I know not what those present saw of all this, but I saw that some gazed up in amazement and adoration, while others cast themselves prostrate in fright upon the earth. These apparitions, becoming more and more distinct as they approached nearer, floated over the grotto, and another pathway of light issued from it and arose to the heavenly Jerusalem. The blessed soul of Mary, floating before Jesus, penetrated through the rock and into the tomb, out of which she again arose radiant with light in her glorified body, and escorted by the entire multitude of celestial spirits, returned in triumph to the heavenly Jerusalem. Next day, when the apostles were engaged in choir service, Thomas made his appearance with 2 companions. One was a disciple named Jonathan Elisar, and the other a servant from the most remote country of the 3 holy kings. Thomas was greatly grieved when he heard that the Blessed Virgin was already buried. He wept with an abundance of tears quite astonishing to behold, for he could not forgive himself for coming so late. Weeping bitterly, he threw himself with Jonathan at his side on the spot upon which the blessed soul of Mary had left her body, and afterward knelt long before the altar. The apostles, who had not interrupted their choir chanting on account of his coming, now gathered around him, raised him up, embraced him, and set before him and his companions bread, honey, and some kind of beverage in little jugs. After that, they accompanied him with lights to the tomb. 2 disciples bent the shrubbery to one side. Thomas, Eliezer, and John went in and prayed before the coffin. Then John loosened the 3 straps that bound it, for it rose high enough above the trough-like couch to admit of being opened. They stood the lid of the coffin on one side, and to their intense astonishment, beheld only the empty winding sheets lying like a husk or shell, and in perfect order. Only over the face was it drawn apart, and over the breast slightly opened. The swathing bands of the arms and hands lay separate, as if gently drawn off, but in perfect order. The apostles gazed in amazement, their hands raised. John cried out, "She is no longer here!" The others came in quickly, wept, prayed, looking upward with raised arms, and finally cast themselves on the ground, remembering the radiant cloud of the preceding night. Then rising, they took the winding sheet just as it was, all the grave linens, and the coffin to keep as relics, and returned to the house by the holy way, praying and singing psalms. When they entered the house, John laid the folded linens on a little flap table before the altar. Thomas and the others were in prayer, but Peter went a little apart, as if pondering some mystery. After that, I saw him celebrating divine service at the altar before Mary's crucifix, and the apostles standing in order behind him, praying and singing. The women were standing in the doorways and by the walls of the fireplace. The young servant that had come with Thomas looked quite unlike any of those present. He had small eyes, high cheekbones, forehead and nose remarkably flat, and his complexion was brownish. He was already baptized. He was perfectly innocent and obeyed orders simply. He did all that he was told, remained standing or sitting wherever they told him to do so, turned his eyes in any direction indicated to see whatever was pointed out to him, and smiled upon everyone. When Thomas wept, he wept also. He always remained with Thomas, and I saw him dragging immense stones when Thomas was building a chapel. I often saw the apostles and disciples standing together in circles and relating where they had been and giving their experience. Before the apostles left Mary's house to journey again into distant parts, they rendered the grotto of the tomb wholly inaccessible by raising an embankment of earth before the entrance. At the rear, however, they made a low passage to the back wall of the tomb proper, and an opening in the wall, by which one could look down upon it. This passage was known only to the holy women. Above the grotto they built a chapel of wood and wickerwork, and hung it with mats and tapestry. The little altar consisted of a stone slab. The step, too, was of stone. Behind the altar hung a strip of stuff on which was sewed or embroidered quite simply, in the colors of her festal robes, a picture of Mary. The little garden in front of the tomb, and especially the whole of Mary's Way of the Cross, was beautified by them. While engaged in this task of love, they prayed continually and chanted psalms. The apartment of the house in which Mary had had her oratory and sleeping alcove was converted into a little church. Mary's maid continued her abode in the front part of the house, and 2 of the disciples were left there by Peter for the benefit of the faithful dwelling in that section of the country. The apostles, with tears and embraces, took leave of one another after they had once more celebrated solemn service in Mary's house. An apostle or disciple often returned at different times to pray there. I saw also that here and there, out of devotion and in reverence for the Blessed Virgin, churches were built by the faithful in the same style as her house, and that her Way of the Cross and her tomb were for a long time devoutly visited by the Christians. I had a vision of those early times just after Mary's assumption into heaven. A woman living near Ephesus who entertained great love for Mary visited her house. On her return, she caused an altar like that she had seen there to be made, and covered it with a very costly cloth of tapestry. The woman was very poor, and had to defray the debt she thereby incurred by the sale of a piece of her property. Finding herself after some time in dire distress, she went, though very sorrowfully, to a married Christian, and sold to her the beautiful altar.
Before we get to the end of this video, I'd like to share 3 more clips just so we can wrap this up nicely with a few reminders. The first will be from Father Joseph Iannuzzi.
But rather, what happens when you hang around people that practice black magic or witchcraft or santeria or people that cast curses like the macumba, the evil eye, the malocchio, the sortileggio, different cultures, different races do these things. They can do it against you if they get angry at you. They can involve other people to know how to do it too. And they can carry with themselves what are called amulets that can bring with them misfortune. Just like God has sacraments, physical things that transmit grace, so Satan has his talismans, his amulets that don't transmit, but can bring with them, accompany them, trouble, wherever they are.
And then let's follow this up with Father Daniel Reehil.
When sin increases, the demons have more power, because they're working with malevolence. They're working with people who are doing evil things. And as that increases, they have more power to inflict fear, pain, suffering, all these things, usually through other people. But there's generally a spirit of fear that hovers in these situations. And sometimes you could describe it as a heaviness. You feel a heaviness, or there's a sense of dread or doom. These things are not all natural. They're not all your own emotions.
And here's the last one from Father Reehil.
Feeling deeply overwhelmed sometimes can be a signal, not that our trials are insignificant or that our emotions are too strong, but that we've been carrying them alone. That can be a signal we've been carrying them alone. And that's not the way God intended it. He wants to carry with you anything you have to go through. And he wants to be more engaged in our suffering and intends to breathe his comfort into our very heavy hearts when those moments strike us. I would say when we don't have a proper fear of God, a healthy fear, holy fear of God, then we fear everything else. When we don't have God in the first position, then we fear everything else. So it's important that and it's very sad because when I look out at the world and I see so many people that are choosing to ignore God, are choosing to have complete lack of interest in God, who do not want to go to church, who do not want to pray, who do not want to know anything about Jesus, I don't know how they live. So how is it that somebody can ignore, go through life with no understanding of who God is? What are they experiencing? I mean, they must be having quite a tough time, I would think.
Well then, that will be all for the video this time. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. And hopefully all of you have learned a lot of useful stuff from this video, especially on spiritual warfare. And as always, if there's any suggestion or feedback at all, don't hesitate to let us know in the comments below. Anyway, if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, I left a link to our PayPal donation in the description box below, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your continuous support, contributions, and prayers. And until the next one, thanks again for watching and may God bless you.